Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Roy, and I'm the college's Chief Diversity Officer. My gender pronouns are she and her. Welcome to Teaching Inclusively and Equitably. This is the third in a series of conversations I am hosting with higher education practitioners about the techniques they use to engage all students and help them to succeed, regardless of their race, ethnicity, age, ability, gender identity, socioeconomic status, or family background. We began these conversations during the summer by asking 2 RCC faculty members to share some of the teaching methods and tools they use to support equity and inclusion for all of their students in the virtual classroom. We continued the conversation in October by asking the deans to share their perspectives on how to support equity and inclusion for students enrolled in their schools. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Catherine Wong from the Leadership Brainery. Catherine is a highly recognized consultant and workshop facilitator. At the core of her practice is her competence to work with diverse groups in engaging and navigating difficult dialogue for the purpose of transformation versus perpetuating the status quo. With her guidance, groups develop innovative skills to mobilize informal and formal networks of allied support that allow for surviving and thriving even when faced with the most challenging of circumstances. Catherine has planned a thought-provoking presentation that is designed to help us create a welcoming and participatory culture at the college in which all RCC students and employees can thrive. So please remain muted until asked to speak. We will be sharing a slide presentation during this session. We recommend you choose the side-by-side mode from view options in Zoom so that you can see the speaker and the presentation at the same time. If you have questions, we encourage you to use the chat function. We are recording today's conversation and we'll post it on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. Now we will turn the program over to Catherine.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to see you, even though virtually. As I introduce myself, feel free to add your pronouns. I'm she, her. Share greetings in the chat, as I know that you may not have seen each other on screen in a bit, and one word of how you're feeling today. So Mike, please advance the slide. So again, I'm here to welcome you to a session that I've been talking with Melissa about, as well as Jojo McManus, and I've spent some time looking at the RCC SUNY website. So I'm excited again to be here with you and want to thank Melissa and RCC for the invitation. Next slide. So in preparing for today, and in the way that I start all of my presentations, is to offer a land and labor acknowledgement. That land acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense or historical context. Colonialism is an ongoing current process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. It's also worth noting that acknowledging the land is Indigenous protocol. And I can share a website if you want to sort of see where you live, where you work, and what land you sit on. Given that I'm in Massachusetts right now, that the land that I acknowledge is where the tribes of the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Nauset. I also think it's really important that, given the era that we're in, that we also offer our labor acknowledgements to all of the frontline and essential workers who have provided for us and done so without hesitation and with bravery. And to mention that all of the activities and things that we do today are ways that actually I have begun all of my classes. As I think about working with diverse populations, I always begin every session, every class, with inviting folks to think about the land with which they live, work on, and to pay honor to that, as well as for those who either have families who themselves are essential or frontline workers, or in general to offer our labor and land acknowledgement. So I invite you to do that with me today. Next slide, please. I also start every class or lecture or workshop or webinar with a quote of the day. It's a way to bring everyone into the room. So as you think about the different subjects you teach, how might you invite young people into your classes, into the subject of the day? And so for today's topic, the quote that I've selected is from an author activist, Asian American author activist that I feel inspired by. Her name is Grace Lee Boggs. And she writes, "We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness. In this exquisitely connected world, it's never a question of critical mass. It's always about critical connections." And so that's my hope today, is that in the space that we're in, that we're able to grow some critical connections around what does it mean to teach for and with and about social justice, no matter what we're teaching. Next slide, please. And so what I want to invite you to do right now is to think about your social and professional identity and to jot some notes down. You're going to be using this when we shift into the breakout rooms in a bit. So again, when you think about who are you, rather than just the titles of your job titles, to really, how would you identify your social identity? What words come to mind? So again, just some private notes to yourself that you'd be willing to share when you get into your small group of 3 to 5 people in a few minutes. So again, who are you? Social identity, and then your professional identity. So beyond titles, how would you describe what you do and why you do it? And if I were in a classroom, what I normally do is I ask students to do this in one breath. So I'm not looking for dissertations. I'm not looking for master's thesis. Basically, it's a newspaper headline. So social identity, professional identity. Next slide, please. I also share with my students and with other colleagues and allies that whenever I create an activity or ask a question, I also have to be prepared and vulnerable to answer it myself. So in terms of who am I with regard to my social identity and my professional identity, I aspire to be the best versions of my ancestors. I was very fortunate growing up on the island of Hawaii. Yes, we pronounce every single letter in our Hawaiian language because we only have 12 letters in our alphabet, so every single letter is pronounced. So if you walk away with anything, you learned a little bit of Hawaiian today. That I was lucky and fortunate to grow up with 3 great-grandmothers who are alive through my teenage years, who told me stories upon stories about their journey from China to Hawaii, upon what it meant to live in harmony with the other ethnicities and races on the islands before it became colonized by the New England missionaries. The picture that you see right here on the left, my grandmother was the youngest in her family, and the photo of the person to her right is my great-grandmother who lived to 102, and my grand aunt, which is my grandmother's older sister, is on the far right. My grandmother is in the middle holding an orange and a knit cap, and the picture was taken in Hawaii. So I remember asking my grandmother as a child, why were you in a knit cap and holding an orange in Hawaii? And she said, well, it was my favorite knit cap and that was my favorite fruit. And I was only 4 years old. And in order to keep me in the picture, they had to give me what I wanted. She said, I was a rebel in my family, just like you are. And I took that to be a compliment. I value my Hawaii roots. I value all of the knowledge that was handed down. I value the values of relational values that come with it, the aloha spirit that we often talk about, or the wearing of the flowered lei, which is very symbolic to me because a lei takes over 350 blossoms, and each blossom laid on top of each other creates something beautiful. And so the ways that we think about community, the way that I think about social justice and equity and how we come together. And for that, in terms of who I am, in terms of my professional identity, is that I create pathways for diverse and first-generation college students to be change agents. And that my work for the last 20-something years in higher ed, I was a school counselor prior, that has always been working with young people and really creating opportunities for them to be in circle leadership with me versus having me feel like I have power over them. Next slide. So in terms of coming back to these objectives, I really want us to spend this afternoon thinking about how to continue to advance a welcoming participatory culture within RCC, and then creating a climate that fosters transformative dialogue and meaningful change so that we're going beyond those transactions within the classroom, within your work environment. Next slide, please. And so what I'd like to do here is to share, as I do in classes, is the idea of group agreements. So I tend to move away from setting up a set of rules or norms because I feel that that sets up a sort of superficial hierarchy. What I do instead is I create sort of this opportunity for group agreement, something that even I, as the presenter or the instructor, agree to, so that it's something that we can all be in community about. I'd love to have a volunteer come off mute right now and read this group agreement about confident humility. Who would like to volunteer?
Hi, I'm Ben Dickman. I can read that.
Thank you, Ben.
Group agreements. Authentic dialogue and relationship building requires a sense of confident humility, the self-awareness that we all have wisdom and other assets, and we will always have more to learn. With both confidence and humility, we can approach each challenge, including conflicts and failures, with intentionality as an opportunity for creativity and change.
Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate it. Next slide, please. So in terms of how do we practice confident humility, again, knowing that each of us bring wisdom to the table. So if I could have a volunteer read how we sort of operationalize confident humility.
Sure, I'll volunteer.
Okay. Can you share your name, please?
Sure, Mary Lou Owens. To speak your truth, to lean into discomfort and lean into each other, to expect and accept non-closure, to embrace paradox, to seek intentionality, not perfection.
Thank you, Mary Lou. So again, these idea of using confident humility and group agreements as a way of holding the class in community, holding the group that you're working with in terms of if you're working as an administrator, but the idea being that, again, we all come with a sense of self-awareness and we all sort of have something to contribute. Next slide, please. So as a way of thinking about coming into community, of doing DEI work, that I want to share an overview that a number of years ago, a group of us that were doing DEI work, were looking for a framework that if you think back to when you were in school, whether at K-12, whether in college, that you know the person you were. Are you the person that sort of walked into a room and decided you were going to sit in the front of the class, that you wanted to sort of be first up, you wanted to participate a lot? Or were you the student that sort of stepped in and said, you know what, I'm just going to sit in the middle and kind of check everything out about, you know, in front of me and behind me? Or are you the person that said, I'm always sitting in the back because I really hope I don't get called on? So as we think about when you're making these decisions and you're walking into a classroom, you're doing what we would call an environmental scan. Or if you're going into a board meeting or you're going into a community meeting and you kind of check out, you know, I often check out, okay, am I the only, in whatever respect, am I the only woman in the room? I am the only person of color. I'm the only Asian American. Again, depending on where how I'm situating myself. But being able to take this moment to step in and figure out, okay, where am I in this room and who am I in this room, helps me decide how much or little am I going to participate? Am I going to meet with resistance? Am I in a company of allies? And so we were having this conversation, a number of us, and we started to ask each other these set of questions. How do we conduct a historical assessment of our own career path? When was that moment that DEI truly came into focus for you? And how do you maintain a continuous growth trajectory? Next slide, please. And so with these questions in mind, we found this mapping the campus climate that was first introduced by Jay Mellum, and that has since been adapted by two other colleagues with me, Patricia Lari and Jacqueline Reza. And what we realized is that our experiences in higher ed were mapped along this environmental scan overview. And that when we think about the historical context into our own path, for me, it was going from a practitioner, as a school counselor, as a classroom teacher, realizing that I wanted to have greater impact, and I shifted into higher ed, educating the very teachers that were going to go back into the schools that I had been in to teach our children. And so looking at the social historical forces that brought me into higher ed in the first place, when was that moment that DEI truly came into focus for me was particularly in my work, realizing that our teaching force was not as diverse as it could be, that our young people were not in classrooms where they saw visions of themselves or reflections of themselves in their own experiences. So that moved me into that second box on the right around looking at compositional diversity. How do I sort of expand our graduate programs to really be diverse and reflective of the communities that we were serving? And how do I maintain a continuous growth trajectory was, again, looking at the different psychological dimensions, looking at the historical legacy of inclusion and exclusion. Where do I find my DEI allies, and how do I continue to grow with them? So again, just a quick way about how I sort of use this mapping the campus climate as a way of beginning to map my experiences of how I entered into DEI work in higher ed and how I continue to find support. So what I'm going to do now, next slide, is this is on your handout, is I wanted to give you some time to work with the map. And so I'm asking you in your small groups to do sort of work with 3 questions. So in the handout, you have the map, and then you have these questions. How do you survey the campus climate? So when you think about your campuses, when you step into a meeting, you step into a classroom, what are some of the assumptions that you make? With regard to the environment, again, what are your relationships with your colleagues, with supervisors? How are you prompting each other to be more creative with DEI work? Knowing that you're already on that path, that you've already been doing this work, that you've had this speaker series, you have an office committed to it. So how are you in your work prompting each other to be more creative, given that a lot has changed in our world in the last several months? How are you a good ally, and how do you know you're being a good ally? There's a lot of talk about we need to be allies for each other. We need to be allies for students. And the question comes to mind for me is, again, how are we doing that, and how do we know that we're being a good ally? What I'm going to ask is, after, you're going to have 10 minutes in small groups to have this conversation. Please introduce yourselves briefly with your social and professional identities. And then you'll have a 1-minute warning before you come back to the whole group. And I'm going to ask you to select a reporter who will share 2 to 3 highlights in the chat when we come back. Are there any questions before we break? So again, you're going to go into small groups. You're going to work with these questions. And then before we end, you're going to choose, before you end, you're going to choose 2 to 3 highlights to share with the full group. Okay, breakout rooms will begin soon. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. So what I'd love for you to do now is, I'd love to hear very quickly sort of 1 highlight from each group. We had 5 groups. So hopefully you all volunteered or voluntold somebody. So who was in group 1? Highlights from group 1. Highlights from group 1.
Susanna, you want to do it, or you want me to do it?
Go ahead, George.
The highlight of the group 1 is Marcella, student, international student at the campus, and she was able to. She was worrying about it coming into a foreign country and not knowing anybody, but she found a place to be comfortable and friendly, and she feels very comfortable on campus and has made some friends.
Okay, great. Thank you. Group 2.
Ben Dickman for Group 2.
Hi, Ben.
We didn't realize that we didn't see the 1-minute warning, so we were just like really going at it. But as far as the first question, surveying campus climate, it pre-COVID, people, who had contact with students and instructors. So, the students are pretty vocal about how they feel about things, and especially if you get their trust. After COVID, like we're more being in touch with things through webinars. We have a counselor who meets students, and in the current COVID situation with people working from home, there's a lot more frustration. People have problems focusing. Students who had done well in counseling are regressing. People who are in RCC are pretty happy because here they have real peers who they can interact with face to face, mask to mask. The ones who are working from home are more stressed and unhappy. So that was what we had time to do, was just climate.
Okay. Thank you. Group 3.
Hi, this is Angie.
Hi,
And
Angie.
hi. We spent a lot of time talking of our social identity and professional identity. So we had very little time. The 10 minutes went so quickly to talk about the instructions. But one of the things that stood out to me is that Mary Lou Owens was so impressed. We were talking about how do you become an ally, or are you an ally, or are you a good ally? And she shared something that I don't even remember anything else, but she shared that she is such an ally that the other 2 people that were in our group, Jason and Idanya, she saw a presentation that they did, and I'm not really quite sure. She'll have to jump in and tell us what the presentation was. But what she said was she was so excited that she was in our group, because she had replayed the presentation to her class. So whatever Jason and Idanya had stated left such an impression on her that she promoted them in her class. So she felt that that was her way, not her way, but she felt that she was truly an ally to whatever the cause was. And I wasn't there at the presentation, but maybe you can share a little bit, Mary Lou, what the presentation was.
Please.
Sure. So our college had 2 different presentations, one for Black Lives Matter and another one for the Hispanic Month. And I have to tell you, I think I sat in on both of them after the fact. I don't think I was there live, so I just watched the recording. But I was moved because these are people who I work with and I don't know at all. And even now, when we sat in the room together, I don't know them. I don't know them outside of the video recording that they did. And that's awesome that I do know them because of that simple video recording. And it gave such clarity. I don't want to say it that way, not such clarity. It gave some clarity to who they are as individuals. And not only myself connected, but my students in my class connected. And Lewis is, I don't think he's in this session today, but the man that's in charge of the evening courses, one of my students connected with him so much so that he wrote an essay for me of how much he connected. And I sent it to that evening coordinator and said, this, you meant a lot to my student because he's passing you in the hallway in the evening courses. And so, yeah, I was excited to be in the room with the two of you, all three of you, I should say, Angie, you too. But it was very motivational just having the recording available to myself and to my students. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Can we hear from group 5, please?
Yes. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Renee Glick, and I teach students from other countries for the English Skills Academy as part of the School of Arts and Humanities now. And I was
Okay.
honored to be in this group because I was with my dean, but I was with a young lady that really inspired me. She's from Pakistan. Her name is, I hope I don't mispronounce it, Larib.
Correct.
Oh, good. Okay. And what really inspired me is she finished high school here within 8 months, and she's become a peer mentor and a peer mentor who helps with registration and admissions. And she's a cybersecurity and cyber major, and she has felt welcomed at the school. She did give a very constructive suggestion about how student advisement could be improved, because when she came here, there was an older system in place. But she loves it here, and her survey of the campus climate, extremely positive. Her field of study, she's very, very motivated. And I just feel as an educator, and I'm sure Dean Burke does too, that we just feel inspired and motivated by students like this, and it just gives us more energy to just move forward with pathways and any other way we could work within the institution to help students like her.
That's great. Thank you. Have all the groups gone, or did I leave out a group?
You left us out.
Okay, go please. Sorry, I lost count.
That's okay. We did too. Hi, it's Ronnie O'Neill, and our group was terrific. It was made up of people with all different roles at the college, from student, faculty, to counselor, administration. We had it all, and we found very quickly that we were a group of back of the classroom introverts, and that these roles that we currently occupy have required us to work on transforming ourselves from the way we were when we were kids to what we're trying to be going forward. And I think we all agreed that part of what we're trying to do is provide the students and the community with a vision that that there's opportunity for them at RCC, and that the choices that they make, as long as they work hard enough, they can be whatever they dream to be.
Thank you. And sorry for leaving the last group out.
Right,
Mike, can we, thank you, Ronnie. Can we go to slide 11, please? Back to slide 11. So as you all were sharing your highlights, and I was able to jump through into a few rooms, is that my hope is that this map was constructive, because all of the different stories and the call outs of the experiences of the people in your group sort of landed at different places on this mapping, and that I propose this map as a way of connecting the dots, that folks' experiences in terms of, again, how you yourself was schooled, and then how you now are sort of schooling and working with others, that there is a link, there is a pathway, and that this map helps us to construct that in a way that everything, as you can see, and even by that, the opening quote, is the level of interconnectedness, that, yes, they're governmental and political external forces, but there's also the ways that within the institution that you can offer support, diversity, equity, inclusion support, and that again, the institutional context is framed by all of these different forces, but that all of these different forces can be in support of each other. And so whether we come from a historical legacy of inclusion or exclusion, that the institutions and the stories that you told were about fostering inclusion, fostering a positive climate, thinking about yourselves as introverts coming forward and being now student advisors. And so how do you utilize that experience and then do the transferable skills into the role that you have? And so that as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how does it manifest itself in each of these boxes, knowing that each of these boxes connect in some way? And so going to slide 14, please, Mike. So for the second grouping, another framework that I want to pose that I think intersects well with mapping the campus climate is the work by Tara Yoso. She's out, I believe, in one of the California state universities, and she proposes this idea of community cultural wealth. And so the way that that this is thought about is, you know, if in your classroom or if in a workshop like this, if you were to identify how many of you speak another language other than English. And so you can even do this right now if any of you want to do a quick hand raise or thumbs up using Zoom. So how many of you speak another language other than English? How many of you have students in your classes who speak another language other than English? Again, thumbs up. I can't really see you because I got my slides on, but I hope you all can see each other. How many of you had to share a bedroom growing up? How many of you had to navigate several neighborhoods as you traveled to school, K-12? And so as you think about and you look at sort of, you know, who gave thumbs up, who didn't, is this idea of looking at, you know, for those of you that speak another language other than English, those of you that have students, that we would call that linguistic capital. And it's the whole idea about language has meaning and language is an expression of culture. And so for those of us that do speak another language, instead of just being referred to as, oh, those English language learners or those who need more help, that if we held them up instead and said, you know what, you bring linguistic capital to this institution, that in terms of working toward a global economy, a global workforce, that this is a strength that you bring. When I said that to my 7th through 12th graders, they were just sort of, their chest got up and they're like, yeah, we get linguistic capital. And it's a whole idea about thinking as a strength. I often pose sort of a Fortune 500 job description to my students, have them read it, and it talks about having cross-cultural communication skills. Often these job descriptions ask, can you speak another language? We're looking for multilingual workers. And so the idea, again, of looking at it through this lens of cultural wealth. The other is, you know, if you've had to navigate several neighborhoods as you travel to school, as many of our students do, that gives a level of navigational capital. It gives a way of thinking through, you know, was there a particular neighborhood you had to avoid? What was that route like? And so again, what problem solving skills do you bring to this institution, to the classroom, versus being seen as someone who's impoverished or through that deficit lens that unfortunately we students are still viewed by? And so the other question then we start looking at, you know, who were the mentors, teachers, and coaches that stood out for you? And what lessons do you carry from them into your current work? And so where on this map, in terms of whether it be familial capital, where the particular struggles that your families went through that you now hold on to as a way of encouraging students, you know, as Ronnie was saying, you know, to be all that they can be, how do they fulfill their dreams, their North Star? And so what capital are they bringing into the classroom versus that we often, you know, I have a piece on standardized testing, that standardized tests often measure what students don't know. But what are we doing to actually measure and and take into account what they do know. And so the idea of, how do we look at our students as their lived experiences as being a form of community cultural wealth, and of a way of being able to deeply understanding them in the classroom. And so for this second, next slide, please. For this next small group, it'll be about the same time frame. I know it's quick. The idea was to sort of get the juices flowing here and for these conversations to continue after this session. The idea was to, again, do a spark. And so using this framework, which is also on your handout, you're going to go into the same breakout groups. And the questions here are, what DEI strategies have had the most impact on your teaching and work? And in what ways can you support your colleagues' DEI efforts? Again, you'll be asked to share highlights, and you could choose a different person so that someone else has the opportunity to speak in the whole group. So again, using Tara Yosa's framework, the questions are, what DEI strategy has had the most impact on your teaching and work? And in what ways can you support your colleagues' efforts? We can go into the small groups now. So welcome back. So let's start backwards. So group 6, can you share some highlights from your conversation, please? So group 6. Is group 6 back?
Is that the group?
Yeah,
with
we're here,
Ronnie?
Kathy. I just didn't, no one actually volunteered to speak, but I spoke before, so I don't have to.
Well, then you can volunteer somebody then.
I always hate being voluntold, but hey, Carmen, can you answer the question?
Carmen, you're muted. Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I was
Okay.
already talking.
You're gonna have to repeat. I'm sorry.
Okay. In our group, we were talking about how we were very similar in our strategies by teaching. And somebody teaches a business multicultural class, and the other one is a counselor. And the other one teaches, works with a lot of youth of different age groups, teenagers, and on college. And all of them have a common goal of wanting to better themselves either in the field of business, or they want to better themselves in their course, or even high school for that matter. And they had that common ground of their culture and the wanting to succeed. And we also came to the awareness that in one of the classes, being that they had shared an activity where they felt very connected, because the assignment was to talk about Audubon. And they discovered quickly that even though he was into birds, that he was also a native of Haiti. And many of the students were very excited about that, because he arrived from one place to the other, and that made it a common ground. And quickly, we were talking about how in the business multicultural class, that was also a very common ground, that many were deriving from different places, and that their capital and culture was assimilated in their business transaction, and how it was very functional into the course. And for myself, I had discussed how, even though I taught bilingual education, that my kids were very excited when they were able to do an activity upon themselves where they share, and it soon became their activity where they expanded and grew into something other than that. And so that was what we were talking about, and how it varied. It didn't matter what age group, it didn't matter what specific country, but in the long end point, all of them felt very connected, either because of age or social or economical, and all of them came together because they felt they were part of something.
That there was that sense of belonging based on the different cultural capital that they brought. Thank you, Carmen, and thank you for allowing yourself to be voluntold. Group 5, please.
Hey, Stephen Burke. I guess I can speak for Group 5.
Hi, Stephen.
Two of us in the group are teachers, and we have Louise, who's our wonderful peer mentor. And both of us, Lisa and I, who are teachers, both agreed that the teaching style that really energized us as students was teachers who got away from sort of very traditional models of being sort of the broadcaster of important information that I know and that you don't know and you'll probably never know, to the extent that I know, to teachers who really work from a student success model and try to understand that all the students are bringing a lot to the classroom. And we found that most helpful. And that's the kind of modeling that we try to do as teachers. And it was really interesting talking to Larib, who is a cybersecurity, but also a peer mentor. And she said, well, I don't really do any teaching, but when we talked to her about what she does in helping other students learn how to navigate, learning herself how to navigate from a new culture in a new school. When she first got here, we kept exploring all the levels of teaching that she's actually doing in a very successful way. And in fact, ways that model that what we think are the most successful kinds of teaching in terms of helping others, and which enforces being mindful yourself and lots of metacognitive skills in doing that. And we thought that was she's just a wonderful model of what we would hope other successful students are at RCC.
Great, thank you very much. Group 3.
So I am
Hi, Jason.
Jason, hello. So I'm Jason. I'm in a group with Idanya, Angie, and Mary Lou. And one thing that we found, a commonplace we really found, that our equity lies is in navigational capital. I expressed that I got to see the different cultural symbolic expressions on my way to school. So if it was flags of cultures, or maybe certain traditions that cultures have, that was on display really on a 5-block walk to school. And Idanya shared how some of her experience, she understood what blocks she had to navigate through. Some she had to stay away from, some not to look on that side of the street because it just draws a certain attention that you may not want. So it ultimately shaped her how she raises her child now, and certain things that she went through that she wants to kind of shield her from, but that also kind of made Idanya strong, that she gets to pass on to her, but her daughter may not have to live through that experience. So we found that that was a common place where our equity lies.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. Group 2?
Yeah, Ben Dickman for Group 2. It was just me and Greer Griffith, and she had to leave for another meeting at 4. So she was the one who really had the most contact. I was more like a webinar contact person, and I'm not so much of an influencer, but she, being a counselor, learned a lot from students' problems, and she learned that she has to start with them where they are as an individual and get their trust, learn to listen, and then she'd be able to help them. They would be at that point willing to share their pain and talk openly. And that was the process by which she could help them heal themselves. So it was a very interpersonal type of, it involved social capital and personal connection. really, getting to, I am going to show you that you are worthy, you have such positive things, and you can leverage them to succeed. So I'm not sure where that fits in this circle of ellipses here, but I guess social would be the
Yes,
closest.
social, yeah, and cultural. Thank you, Ben. Group 1,
Group one, member of our group had to leave earlier, so it will
okay,
be me speaking again.
okay, George.
The other member didn't feel so comfortable speaking. So it was a consensus among three of us that familial capital was the one that was the most important for three of us.
Okay,
The family importance of education and importance of not judging others and respecting other individuals that are different from us. And that was the consensus.
okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating and utilizing this framework. What I want to comment on is that I appreciate that you were sort of looking at all, again, this is a framework just like sort of the first one in terms of going from looking at the context to then actually mapping on the strengths. So the way that I tie both of these frameworks together, of which you have a copy on your handout, but the way that you were mapping both your personal sort of cultural wealth with then how do you bring it into your professional cultural wealth with your students, and what cultural wealth are your students bringing to you? A couple of the ways that I introduce this when I'm working with students is I start by the question of what does it mean to be smart? Because this question often sort of stirs up that the responses often come in sort of book form, right? That it comes from an academic smart definition versus then asking some of the questions that I posed to you before you broke out into small groups, that what does it mean to be smart can be having linguistic capital, can mean having navigational capital, can mean having social capital. And so that it comes back to that both, language and words matter. And so flipping that script to go from deficit to strength. And so, even thinking about words such as, minority, that I tend not to use that anymore. I talk about people have been minoritized, experiences have been minoritized. And so how do we, as in our professional work, look to create opportunities to revision our students, to revision our experiences, that when we often also use the word underrepresented, and is it more accurate for us actually to say historically excluded? And so again, being able to say that inclusion is about looking at all forces of this cultural wealth map and being able to value what students bring into the classroom, but also what your peers bring into the community. And then, given all that's happened with COVID, that particularly for those of you in teacher education, that we tend to use the word learning loss. But what if we were to shift that? I was listening to a webinar by John King last night, and he said, what if we were to reframe learning loss to unfinished learning? And so again, how that we envision our work with students, our work together, that unfinished learning versus learning loss. And so again, thinking about ways that we choose our language and we choose how we interact with students. And so my hope today is that that has stirred up, again, different ways of thinking, of doing this work, particularly from an equity and social justice framework. And what I'd like to do is invite you as we end to have the last word per se. Is in the chat, I would love just to have one word of appreciation for your time with each other and your time looking at these frameworks. So again, feel free just to drop one word in the chat. And then if we could go to slide 17, please. So as you share appreciations with each other, that I want to leave you again with a little bit of my Hawaiian values and culture. And that growing up, I did a senior oral history in high school and discovered that there's both not just Chinese heritage in my lineage, but also Hawaiian. And so from that day forward, I made it a point to really embrace my Hawaiian history. And so in Hawaii, we actually don't say goodbye. We say until we see you again, which is a hui ho, until we meet again. And mahalo nui loa is thank you very much. And a Hawaiian proverb that has meant a lot to me and really becomes a daily mantra for me. I'll read it in Hawaiian first. A'ohe pagaiki ika halau ho'okai. All knowledge is not taught in the same school. One can learn from many sources. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your participation today. I know it's not easy always to do it virtually, but my hope is that you had time to engage with each other, given that you don't always have that opportunity on campus, and that you have two frameworks, which I hope can be useful in some way as you continue this work. That I'm here as a resource. I would appreciate if any of you would like to reach out to talk further. But again, my hope is that these activities are something that you can use in your classroom. So whether it be, the one word check-in, whether it be discussing. What I do with students is I say, please share your social identity and then share your student identity. And then I introduce myself in terms of my social identity and my professional identity. And then we sort of map the connections. And that is the way that we begin the semester. So with that, again, my deepest thank you to Melissa for helping me organize this. And I want to give a shout out to Ronnie Veronica O'Neill. We were classmates at Holy Cross many years ago, and she was certainly part of a group of students at Holy Cross that, for me being far away from home for the very first time and never having seen snow, never having dealt with anything colder than 60 degrees, but to have a welcoming community in college that saw me for who I was, that she was definitely part of that community for me. So I publicly want to thank her, and it was nice to find this small world connection. But again, Melissa, the entire team of Mike and Evan and Danielle on the tech side, I really appreciate you assisting me with this presentation. Melissa, is there anything you want to add before we close? I'm right on time.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, right on time. I really appreciate all the insight that you brought, and it looks like from the comments in the chat, others do as well. I see things like inspirational, grateful, enlightening, inspiring, and I think that sums things up quite well. So I am quite appreciative of the time that you gave us today to really talk about things that I think will allow students to, one, feel like we meet them where they are, and that we are starting to create an environment where they feel both welcomed and that they belong. So I want to thank each of the registrants for joining us today. I think this is a great way for us to wrap up our Teaching Inclusively and Equitably series for this semester, but more is coming in the spring. I expect that we will have one more Our Voices conversation before the end of the fall semester. So keep an eye out for the save the date for that. Thanks everyone for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.